America's founding fathers looked to the most when they were putting together our government without a king.
Amazing. I mean, it sounds like in some ways the Hebrew Bible and the Bible in general has been the operating system of America. And so if you eliminate the operating system of America, what does America have to identify itself as? Borders?
Interesting study was done of the books that the founding fathers quoted from. Montesquieu, Shakespeare, John Locke, Hughes, all these different ones, Hobbes. But the out of like 15,000 different documents and books and pamphlets that the 55 writers of the Constitution quoted from, guess what was the most quoted book? The book of Deuteronomy.
Oh, of course.
It's a book of laws.
Of course.
And they're writing laws, right?
Of course.
I actually have a copy of a Massachusetts blue law book printed in the 1700s. And it has the scripture verse after every law.
Unbelievable.
Right? It's a crime to steal, Exodus, and thou shalt not murder. And Matt Staver was arguing a case before the Supreme Court, and he has the Liberty Counsel, and he was asking me to do a sort of a expert witness testimony and so I took each commandment individually and searched through all of my research of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and because most people just look for where do they mention 10 commandments. I said, well, let's look at each commandment individually, and so I put it together, and he used it in his brief and over a 10 commandment monument that was in Kentucky, and it was fascinating. You think, well, how can I'm the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other gods before me, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. It's like, how can that be in law? Well, in 1811, People versus Ruggles, a case in New York, someone had taken God's name in vain, and they fined him $500. They said, if we allow someone to take God's name in vain, it destroys the efficacy of oaths in a court of law. Efficacy, the effectiveness.
It actually makes total sense.
And so if you're going to swear to tell the truth, whole truth, not but the truth, so help you God. But if you allow them to take God's name in vain, it's like, there's no motivator to this guy.
Wow.
And it destroys the judge and jury's confidence that this guy's going to tell the truth.
Amazing.
And even George Washington said, what security can there be if religious obligation desert the oaths, which are instruments of investigation in our courts of justice? And it's like religious obligation. So when the idea of an oath is to call a higher power to hold you accountable to perform what you said you were going to do. Because they knew politicians would have backroom opportunities to do dirty deals. But if they believed in God, that he was looking over their shoulder, it would hopefully be a deterrent to them.
Yeah.
But if you get rid of God, then you just have a bunch of laws that some old men made up. Why follow them? Some will, as long as it's socially convenient, but others are going to say, forget this. I got a really brilliant mind. I'm going to use it to benefit myself. And they'll look, it's like, water seeks its own level. They'll find a crack. They'll find a way to abuse the system. So I read through, the Constitution and Bill of Rights, and I looked up the word election, electing, electors. It appears dozens of times. Not once does it tell you how to have an honest election. They assumed that the people would be honest, right? But once you remove this morality of honesty, it is so easy to cheat in elections.
Yeah.
There's a million different ways to cheat in elections. So John Adams says our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate for the government of any other. Now he's referring to Judeo-Christian religion. And he even said the 10 Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount are my religion, right? And but you add difficulty with a religion like Islam, where you have something called taqiyya, sacred lying, holy deceit, that you're obligated to lie to the infidel if you feel threatened or, if you think it can advance the cause. And so that's a dilemma, because if you have somebody swearing in on a Quran, where the Quran claims that it is directly from Allah, therefore they hate people participating in writing their own laws.
So
they like top down. They don't like top up. So when the founders were saying God and religion, they were referring to the God of the Bible.
So how do you reconcile religious freedom with having Islamic communities in the United States of America, I mean, they have the right to pursue their own religion here. So why isn't this a Judeo-Christian Islamic country?
Well, there's freedom for all religions in America, but Islam is not just a religion because Muhammad was not just a religious leader. He was a political leader and he was a military leader. He fought in 66 battles, killing an estimated 3,000 people. And so it's a threefold system. It's a religious, political, and military system. And so we faced this during the Cold War, where communists were coming into America saying, we want to take advantage of the freedom of speech, press, and assembly so that we can overthrow America and set up a form of government that does not allow freedom of speech, press, and assembly, right? So Eisenhower said no group can use the Bill of Rights as a privileged sanctuary from which to wage war to destroy the Bill of Rights. You can't say we want freedom of religion, but our ultimate goal is to set up Sharia, where it's the death penalty to leave Islam. I was at a conference just recently and spoke with Nisar Hussain, and he's a Pakistani in London, and he converted to Christianity, and his own friends and family tried to kill him because Sharia says you cannot convert.
You can't leave.
You can't leave the religion. And so he actually started a movement, legalize apostasy.
Wow.
It's like, but even Eleanor Roosevelt, her UN Charter of, Human Rights, says everybody should be able to have the freedom to join a religion and leave a religion. And America's founders fled from England. So the kings of England, they wanted a theocracy. It was my way or you're going to be persecuted, or I'll burn you at the stake. America's founders fled that and fled to America. And so that's why they cherished freedom of conscience. And they didn't get along, but then they all had to work together against the King of England. And then they said, Jesus said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, I want to be tolerated, so I want to tolerate others. Evangelism, that at the time of the founding, you had small groups of others come in. And it's this idea that if you wanted to reach other people with the gospel, you had to let them come in and live amongst you, sort of do neighborhood evangelism. The first missionary sent out from America is pretty much considered Adoniram Judson in 1812 after the Haystack Prayer Revival and the Second Great Awakening Revival. And he went over to Burma. So, but the idea of getting in a boat, going across the world, never seeing your family again, you don't know how you're going to support yourself. The only non-Asian, that idea hadn't come until this early 1800s Second Great Awakening Revival. Then they sent missionaries to Hawaii, missionaries to Jamaica, all this and all.
But their idea was not to do takia. Their idea also was not to force people
Correct.
to, love Jesus and love the Bible. Their idea was to make them fall in love with it without forcing them to do it.
Yeah, and so it goes back to God is love. He loves you, and he wants you to love him back. But for love, to be loved, it must be voluntary. Right? It cannot be forced. And so in the other different scenarios, they're forcing it. But William Penn was put in the Tower of London for 8 months. And William Penn said, force makes hypocrites. 'Tis persuasion only that makes converts. And so he fled and founded Pennsylvania, and he allowed the first synagogue, right there, or one of the first ones. And then he allowed the first English-speaking Catholic church in the world, St. Joseph's, in like 1735. And so the idea in Pennsylvania was unique because in some of the other colonies, even though they fled from persecution in England, when they came here, they set up their own. They wanted religious uniformity in Massachusetts of the Puritan faith. And so that's when you had the Baptists fleeing and these other ones, Congregationalists
Human
fleeing.
nature is to want to control, but that covenant is the inoculation, I guess, against it. And the element of e pluribus unum, right? Realizing that you have to be from any one in order to maintain this covenant of the United States, well, eventually the United States of America. You talk about in your book, who is the king in America? Because I think that what you're describing here is a model that is so brand new that the founders, who were, by the way, incredibly young envisioned for our country. I can only imagine if they watched us now what they would be thinking. But tell me a little bit about that book, and how did you come to want to write it, and what do you think are the important lessons out of it for us, especially today?
Yeah, well, in America, the people are the king, and it's this idea of this overview of world history. And I sort of capsulized some of the themes
Yeah.
that I touched on the other books. That ancient Israel was the first model without a king, and then you had these pastors and their churches founding New England, and then you had the Lutherans coming over and founding New Ebenezer, Georgia, and then the Catholics founding you know um, Maryland, and so the but this idea that it's the people are the king, and the majority of the people are people of faith. Now, I first started when I did my research. It was in the 1990s, and there's the CIA.gov website, and it lists every nation in the world and every imaginable statistic you want to know: amount of arable land, HIV death rate, all this. And you look up Japan, and it's like 80% Buddhist. And you look up, India, and it's like 80% Hindu. And you look up, Pakistan, it's 90% Muslim, and Saudi Arabia, 100% Muslim. And I looked up the United States, and believe it or not, 30 years ago it said 94% Christian.
30 years ago, the United States was 94% Christian?
Yeah, and so in 30 years it's gone down 30%. So now it's at 64%. But the idea is that still a majority. And so, since they're Christian, they go to church, which makes the pastors counselors to the king. And some uh, some pastors tell the king to go to sleep, and
Mm.
others throw ice water on their congregation and says, you don't just have the right to vote in America; you're going to be held accountable for what happens.
Mm.
And so I used the little picture. Imagine visiting a king, maybe in the Old Testament, and you're going through the streets of Jerusalem, and maybe you're witnessing crimes, and you get into the king's chamber, and he's all worried, and he looks up at you, and he says, "I wish somebody would fix this." And you look at him, it's like, "Well, you're the king.
The
This is your
people are the
kingdom.
king in
I
America.
think you're the one that's accountable to God to fix this mess." That's like somebody in America watching TV, seeing all the terrible stuff going on, saying, "I wish somebody'd fix it." Hello, have a finger reach through the screen and tap you on the shoulder. You're the king.
Yeah.
Right? You're the one accountable to God to fix it. Well, I need somebody to tell me what to do. Since when does the king sit on his throne and say, "Can somebody tell me what I'm supposed to do? Hey, butler, come here. Cook, what am I supposed to do?" No, it's your job to be educated on the issue, seek God's will, and you tell your representative what needs to happen. You're the king.
Mm.
And so the message of don't get involved in politics is be a negligent king, right? There's a verse in the New Testament, Romans 13, that says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authority." Well, who's the governing authority in a monarchy? It's the king. Who's the governing authority in a republic? It's the
The people.
citizens, the people, right? And so the idea is that we have a responsibility. Proverbs says, "A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children." What better inheritance can we leave than a country where they have the freedom to believe what they want and hopefully love God back, right?
Yeah.
But then they can pursue their dreams, and they can be blessed in pursuing their dreams, and they can bless other people. But we don't want this freedom to allow somebody else
Mm.
with views diametrically opposed to ours to come in and program our children to hate us and to hate our country. It's like, no, this freedom of conscience is not designed to allow you to, like Eisenhower, wage war against us.
Mm.
It's this idea that you have this freedom because of our Judeo-Christian heritage, because of this concept of God being a God of love, and he wants you to love him back, but for love to be loved, it must be voluntary, right? Not to set up, if I were to sum up Western civilization in one word, it would be individual.
Mm.
That you have a worth because you individually are made in the image of God. And this God is not a respecter of persons, so everybody is equal. So rights from a creator, and the government's purpose is to guarantee to you your creator-given rights, and we're all equal. But all the rest of the world, your worth is dependent on what group you belong to.
Mm.
And if you're a Muslim male, you're worth more than a Muslim female, who's worth more than a kafir infidel. In India, they have a caste system. If you're a Brahmin in the highest caste, you're worth more than a Dalit, untouchable, in the lowest caste. If you're in a communist country, your worth is dependent on your utility, your usefulness to the government. Right? If you can contribute to the big state, you're worth more, and if you're not, the state will kill you. But in this Judeo-Christian West, you're worth something because you're made in the image of the Creator. That is a Bible idea.
What an amazing idea to think of Americans as the kings, and kings who don't get involved and don't care what is happening are basically bad, lazy kings.
Yeah.
That's such a great way to think
It
about
reminds
it.
you of those prophets in the Old Testament going to the king, said, "You're allowing all this wickedness in there. You know, you're reading the
Yeah.
book of Kings. Well, this is a bad king. This is a
Yeah,
bad king.
king.
You know,
Yeah, it
because
makes
he's
total
allowing.
sense.
He didn't tear down the high places. And
You know, Bill, you talked about what's happening in our education system. And one of the things that really worries me is the typical thing that tyrants and communists will try to do, and that is to try to divide us. They want to break our e pluribus unum, that magic sauce of from many one, and they want to bring in multiculturalism. They want to pit us against each other so that we fight. You wrote a book about tyrants. Can you help us think through what is the attack on America, this division of e pluribus unum causing us?
imagine being in heaven and somebody sowing division. Well, it happened. It was the devil, right? And
Mm.
he's cast out. And so he sows division in the garden and gets Adam to blame Eve and Cain to kill Abel. And then there's this interesting story of Gideon has an illegitimate son named Abimelech. Now, Gideon just defeated 100,000 Midianites. There is no country even thinking about invading Israel from the outside. But on the inside, Abimelech wants power. So he's an illegitimate son. So he goes to the town of his mother's called Shechem. And he tells the men, is it better for you that the sons of Gideon reign over you? Remember also that I am your flesh and your bone. And the men of Gideon said, well, we got to support him because he is our brother. And so he did identity politics.
Mm.
He's sowing division. Here you have a country that is strong, just defeated the enemies, but on the inside, you have somebody sowing division. And so Abimelech gets a bunch of followers, and they go to the house of Ophrah, and they kill all of Gideon's sons. And Abimelech makes himself king. And he's terrible, and he's waging war on a town, and a lady throws a millstone over the wall, and it hits him in the head and kills him. If she hadn't have done that, Israel would have had a monarchy right then, rather than 150 years later with Saul.
Mm.
Right, but this idea that how did he get power? He sowed this division on the inside, and we see this over and over again. But even 500 years ago, Italy was a bunch of city-states: Venice, Genoa, Naples, Florence, and they always fought. And Machiavelli thought if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. So the end was good. And so the book is where you get the phrase, the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling all of Italy is such a good end because it'll stop all the infighting between these Italian city-states that any means necessary to get there is justified. So if a prince wants to conquer a city and the city does not want to be conquered, they would hate him. But if the prince pays criminals to sow division and to burn barns and kill cows and set things on fire, the people of the city will cry out for help. The prince will come in, get rid of the very criminals that he bribed to create the mess. Nobody will know the better for it, and they'll praise the prince as a hero. So it's good marketing. You create the need and fill it. You go around the back of the house, set it on fire, then you go around the front of the house and sell them a fire extinguisher, and they'll pay anything for it and even thank you for being there. So it's called Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on a crisis to consolidate control. And then we'll look at Germany. In the early 1800s, it was a bunch of kingdoms: Saxony, Bavaria, Prussia, and they didn't get along. And you had the king of Prussia had a philosopher named Hegel at the University of Berlin. And he is famous for his Hegelian dialectics. It's a triangle of one, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And so one of Hegel's students was Karl Marx.
Of course.
And Karl Marx says, okay, dialectics is the thesis. The thesis is the status quo, We have to create a problem that's real bad, and then everybody will panic and surrender their freedoms to settle for an answer that's just half as bad. Then that becomes the new starting point. You create another problem that's real bad. Everybody settles, for your answer that's half as bad, and you keep creating crises so that people will give up their freedoms. The same way that that Abimelech created this internal crisis, and so the idea is that you see today this creating of crises intentionally so that people give up their freedoms and they give up their republic and they go back to a dictatorship.
Didn't Great Britain also use this in India?
Right. So 1714, you had the British sailor stopped off in Bengal, and the king was sick, and he knew a little medicine and doctored him up, and the king gave him a bunch of presents and said, anything else? He goes, yeah, I'd like to open a trading post. And then it turned into a trading fort, and the British East India Company. And then the fort would give guns to some allies, but then they'd give guns to some other ones, and till pretty soon then they would stir up ancient animosities between the kingdoms.
Why?
So they would fight each other and weaken each other. And then the British could conquer both kingdoms that were weakened and restore order and disarm them. And then they did it again and again and again until they took over all of India.
So this divide and rule is not necessarily a new thing.
Right. And you look at all the colonizing powers, like when the Belgians colonized the Congo and Rwanda, the people saw themselves as one. But the colonizers would measure them and their features, and they would say, you're a Hutu and you're a Tutsi. And they would make them go down to the government offices and register as a Hutu and a Tutsi. And then they began to stir them up against each other. So they would fight each other. And then once they're fighting and weakened, then they could conquer the whole country, right?
I was always wondering why they would fight.
They created a racial distinction that had not existed there before because they want to sow this division. It's like the devil to divide, right? And then you look at the British with America. And after the French and Indian War, the American settlers and the Indians had reached an equilibrium, getting along. And the British General Johnny Burgoyne lands in Canada, comes down, meets with the Mohawk Indians, and stirs them up and promises them money for scalps. And so the Indians begin scalping the Americans. And it got so out of hand that it's one of the reasons listed in the 27 complaints in the Declaration of Independence of why we were rebelling. The king has incited natives on the frontier, the merciless savage whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of men, women, and children, but is saying, here's the king going in and stirring up the natives to attack the Americans. And then this basically became the Marxist model, and especially after the Cold War. So how do you destroy a country? The KGB would send in agents to observe all the groups. They called it critical theory, where you simply observe all economic groups. The proletariat versus the bourgeois, the working class against the business owners, ethnic groups, Bosnians, Croats, Serbs, religious groups, Sunni, Shia, Orthodox, and they would categorize them as victims and oppressors, haves and have-nots. And then they would stir them up against each other to fight, and they would have bloodshed. And then when the bloodshed happened, people want to blame somebody, and they would co-opt the media to blame the leader of the country. And as his popularity would fall, they would do a coup or a rigged election and replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. All the violence stops, and everybody's happy for a while until they realize we just gave up our freedom. And they called them behind the Iron Curtain, Soviet satellites. And then the CIA learned how to do it in reverse. And so Iran's leader in 1953 was Mossadegh. He nationalizes, takes control of all the oil. People don't realize that in 1908, Britain formed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, better known as BP. Iran had a secular leader named Reza Shah, and he was friends, but he got overthrown. Mossadegh was in power, and anyway, so the CIA wanted to get rid of Mossadegh and put in Reza Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi, and so the CIA basically did the Soviet tactics in reverse. And Kermit Roosevelt Jr. is the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, and he's an expert in foreign languages. And he organizes the country, with the people that are disgruntled and the other ones, and organizes riots and protests, and then co-ops the media to blame Mossadegh. His popularity falls. He gets put under house arrest, and then we put in Reza Shah Pahlavi, who loves America, and he met with Eisenhower, Truman, Kennedy, Nixon, Ford, but Jimmy Carter betrayed him and brought in the Ayatollah. So all the problems in Iran, we can thank Jimmy Carter for those.
Amongst many other problems.
But it was Obama that turned these tactics that the CIA were using on other countries' soil to help keep countries from the Soviet orbit. Obama in 2014 turned them inward on America. It's called the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act.
I was just going to say, a lot of what you're describing, this sowing of division, the multiculturalism, the looking at your neighbor suspiciously because you don't have the same last name or you may not worship the same religion. It sounds familiar. It's what literally social media feels like right now.
Yeah. I in my book, Socialism, I actually dedicated it to Charlie Kirk, and we did interviews on it, and he loved the one part I bring up is, so how do you get a free people to give up their freedoms? Fear and free stuff. If you get them into fear, they'll panic and trade their freedom for security. But the second way is free stuff. And they'll incrementally give up their freedom to keep the free stuff coming.
Yeah.
And so it's like, how do you catch pigs in the wild? In Texas, they have a lot of wild pigs. You put a post in the ground and you throw some corn down. The next day, there's 2 posts and you throw the corn down. The pigs come, eat the corn, ignore the post. Next day, there's 3 posts and they'll just keep eating the corn. And then you start putting the posts in a semicircle until pretty soon it's almost a complete circle. And there's just a little opening. And the pigs come, squeeze through the opening, they're eating their corn, and you shut the gate and you caught yourself some wild pigs. You catch them through dependency. And so the Karl Marx, his followers were called the Frankfurt School. But then when they got driven out of Germany, they came to Columbia University in New York. And the professors were socialists. And they said, you'll never defeat America with tanks. You have to do it through the back door. You have to do it through this dependency. And so it was Richard Cloward, Francis Piven, called the Cloward-Piven strategy. And they're the ones that counseled LBJ to do all the Great Society programs. And the idea is that if the country can be economically unstable, the people will voluntarily come to the government and say, please help. And the government says, okay, we'll help, but we're going to take control of your life in the process. And it takes this Cloward-Piven strategy and implements it where there's almost an intentional effort to get people to sign up for welfare benefits, because then they'll always vote for the candidate that gives them the free stuff. And you've built yourself a voter base. But there's 2 ways to institute socialism. One is through the tanks and the other is through dependency.
And that's when people just give up their own freedoms because they are so addicted to the free stuff.
Yeah, I tell people, if you were getting a $1,000 check in the mail every week from someone you didn't know, week after week, would you stop and ask yourself, who's sending me this $1,000 every week? I'm going to find out who they are and vote them out of office.
No.
It's like, would anybody do that? It's
Probably
like,
not.
I got a couple more bills to pay. So once you get people to receive free money, you can count on their vote.
Bill, most of your books have been about America. I know that you're obviously very focused on our own country. You ran for office. Why did you decide to write a book on Quran? Why do you think there is stuff that every American should know about the Quran?
Right. Well, the Keith Ellison sworn to Congress as the first Muslim with his hand on a Quran. It was Jefferson's Quran. And the news media said, isn't this wonderful? Jefferson must have loved Islam. And I was like, he fought the Muslim Barbary pirate wars against the Muslims. And so I thought somebody has to set the record straight. And so Muhammad was a warrior. He fought in 66 battles and raids. And so his men would raid caravans, but then they went to the Mediterranean and they would raid ships. And they would raid the coasts of Spain and Italy and France and bring the slaves into North Africa. They enslaved over 1 million Europeans. There were whole Catholic orders in Europe through the Middle Ages called the Trinitarians, and the head of the order was called the ransomer.
The Muslims enslaved Europeans?
Correct. Yeah, and then they also enslaved black. So Muhammad was a white Arab. There are hadiths that says Muhammad was the white man reclining on a couch. Another hadith, he was lifting his arms. They saw the whiteness of his armpits. Another hadith, he was on his donkey. It rubs up against somebody else. And the guy said, I saw the whiteness of the prophet's thigh. And Muhammad owned black slaves like Bilal. And so Islam enslaved tens of millions of Africans, castrate the men, make them eunuchs, sell the women into sex trafficking. Timbuktu, where the canoe meets the caravan, was a big slave trading city. Khartoum, Zanzibar coast, Tanzania. And they sold blacks for centuries across Africa and then the Ottoman Empire. But then when the Turks invaded Europe, they would capture Christian towns, Bulgaria and Albania and Romania, and they would take the Christian boys and make them into their Muslim Janissary soldiers. And then, in Egypt, they were called Mamluk slave soldiers. And so the idea is that the Europeans would pay an annual tribute to the Muslim pirates to leave their country's ships alone. Even Sweden, in the 1600s, some Muslim pirates raided Baltimore, Ireland, round up the whole town, took them to Morocco, and sold them into slavery. Dragut Reis, and so and even the Pilgrims in 1625, they sent a ship full of beaver skins back to England. And William Bradford said the ship was in the English Channel when a Turkish man of war captured it, took it to Morocco, and sold the crew into slavery. Mm. And so once America became independent of Britain, the Sultan in Morocco said, well, you're not covered under the British tribute payment anymore. You're your own country. You got to pay up.
If otherwise, the Barbary pirates will come after your ships.
Right. And so that's where President Obama said, Morocco was the first country to recognize America's independence. And it's like, yeah, so that they could tax us. And so they were capturing our Americans and enslaving them. The Polly, these different ships. And so right after the revolution, Thomas Jefferson is sent as an ambassador to France, and he meets with Abdurrahman, the Muslim ambassador. And he's like, why are you enslaving us, our men? What did we do to offend you? And the Muslim ambassador said that, no, it's just written in our Quran that all nations that do not acknowledge Islam authority were sinners. And it was a right and duty to make them slaves. And any Muslim who should die in battle is sure to go to paradise. So Jefferson owned a Quran to figure out what's in this book that makes them want to hate us when we didn't do anything wrong to them, rather than the news media saying, oh, Keith Ellison swore into office on Jefferson's Quran. Gee, Jefferson must have loved Islam. No, the day after his inauguration as the third president, he gets a demand from the Pasha of Tripoli for $250,000 extortion tribute payment. And Jefferson said, I did the only reasonable thing. I sent in a squadron of our ships.
Bill, do you think that some Muslims are not that extreme, that they are moderate, where the fundamentalist Muslims basically give Islam a bad reputation?
Yes, I would say most of them are moderate. And so the word Islam means submission to the will of Allah. A Muslim is one who has submitted to the will of Allah, and they think there will be world peace when the whole world submits to the will of Allah. And so to them, world peace means world Islam. And so it's a different definition of the word. So when we say peace, it's different groups that don't believe the same thing learning how to get along. When they say peace, it's when all your enemies are defeated. There's nobody left to conquer. There's nobody left to fight. Now, a moderate Muslim believes the world will submit to Allah later, maybe in the distant future, maybe at the end of the world, maybe it's even figurative. And since it's so far off, they really don't think about it, and they just want to live their lives, and they're wonderful people, and they want to have you as friends and family. And the fundamental Muslim, they want the world to submit to Allah now, and they're really excited, and they want to help make it happen.
And they'll do it by all means.
And the dilemma for the West is the nicer we show ourselves, the fundamental Muslims view that niceness as weakness. And they take that as an invitation to attack. And so we think if we bend over a little bit more, they'll be nice. They see us bend it over. They say, look, Allah's given us our enemies. They're showing their neck, right? And so whenever they would lose a major battle of Lepanto, 1571, Battle of Malta, 1565, Battle of Vienna again in 1683. Whenever they would lose major battles, they would go back and be moderate for a generation or two. But then they would do some probing attacks. And if they didn't get slapped down, then they would take this as a signal they're supposed to get back into the aggressive mode. And so the moderate Muslims prefer to be under the umbrella of the West and enjoy the freedoms. So ladies can wear fashions and they can eat what they want and go out whenever they want. Ladies can leave the house without their husband's permission. They can leave the house without being accompanied by a male relative. So they would prefer the freedoms. But when the fundamental ones do a terrorist attack and the West doesn't come down strong on the fundamental ones, the moderate ones realize, well, gee, if you're not going to defend us, the only player in town is them. We got to lean in their direction.
They have no choice. So the West showing weakness is pushing the moderate Muslims towards fundamental Islam.
And the fundamental Muslims are just as happy to kill a moderate Muslim as they are to kill an infidel, right? So they view them as having backslidden from the way of Allah.
And so is that how they basically took on Christian countries? Like Egypt was a Christian country. Now it's predominantly Muslim. Lebanon, Syria, all of these countries were Christians. Now they're Muslim countries through the same tug of war between fundamentalists and moderate Muslims who basically had no support to push against it?
Yeah, well, in more recent times, they're using our tolerance against us. But originally, they simply played politics. So a little background. Muhammad was born in 570 A.D. His father dies before he's born. His mother dies when he's 6. His grandfather and guardian dies when he's 8. He's orphaned, taken in by an uncle, Abu Talib, who's a merchant, who goes on camel rides to different cities and hears about the different religions. And so some of the cities were Persian, and they had Zoroastrianism that believed that paradise was filled full of virgins that would fulfill all the guy's desires. Muhammad hears this, and it gets incorporated into his belief system. The Zoroastrians also believed in jinns or genies, right, like 1001 Arabian Nights. And then there's a religion of Manichaeism. Mani was this person that thought there was little bits of truth in every religion, and you could sort of extract them. A follower of Manichaeism was St. Augustine, until he met the guy and realized he didn't know what he was talking about, spent the rest of his life debunking Manichaeism. But Muhammad heard about this. Hey, maybe there's little bits of truth in different ones. There's the Sabaeans in the Yemen area, and they were into chopping off, hands and legs, and they would go on pilgrimage, and they'd, spit on the devil and throw rocks at him. And that got incorporated into their traditions. And then in Arabia and Mecca, they had 360 different pagan gods in a square building called the Kaaba. And the most popular was Hubal, the moon god. And they had a rock they thought had fallen from the moon. It's a glass impact rock where a meteor hit the desert sand, melted it into this brown glass. And these pagans would kiss this rock, walk around this rock, bow to this rock for centuries pre-Muhammad. Muhammad kissed that rock. It got incorporated into his belief system. And then he went to some Jewish communities, and he originally had his followers bowing toward Jerusalem for the first 17 months of Islam. And then there's the Christian faith. And even Encyclopedia Britannica says the gospel was made known to Muhammad through apocryphal and heretical sources. So he thought the Trinity was the Father, Mary, and Jesus. Nobody ever explained to him the Holy Spirit. And so Muhammad goes into a cave, and there's a movement sweeping through Egypt at this time called monasticism, where if you really become a Christian, you should give away your money and live in a cave as a hermit. All right, just withdraw.
It sounds so strange.
It's sort of like our version of separation of churches. I'm just going to withdraw from politics. I'm just going to enjoy my own relationship with God. And so they call them desert fathers. But Muhammad goes into a cave and he prays, and a spirit appears to him and squeezes him and commands him to read. And he said, I cannot read, because he was illiterate. Spirit squeezed him a second time, said, read. He said, I cannot read. It happened a third time. And then finally he began to recite. And that's how the Quran came to him. He'd get these verses, he'd recite them till he had them memorized, and he'd teach them to his followers. And people say, how can somebody that's illiterate memorize all these verses? Well, in Arabic, they had a little rhyme to them, a little beat, very similar to rap music, right? Thomas Carlyle wrote in 1840, Arabs see more method in it, and much of it is rhythmic, a kind of wild chanting. So Muhammad goes back to his wife, Khadijah. She's 40 years old. He's 25. He had worked for her, and then she marries him. And and he tells her that he thinks he's demon possessed. And she decides to test the spirit, according to Ibn Ishaq, The Life of Muhammad. And so she has him sit on her left thigh and says, "Can you see the spirit?" He goes, "Yes, over there." It has him sit on her right thigh. "Can you see the spirit?" "Yes, over there." Then she began to disclose her form and take off some of her veils and says, "Can you see the spirit?" And he said, "No." And she said, "Well, it must have been from God because it was embarrassed to look upon me without all my veils on." So that was the test.
Is this something that like people who study Islam verify and
Yeah,
believe?
it's in their traditions. Yeah, Ibn Ishaq, and so she takes Muhammad to her cousin, who's an Ebionite Christian priest, this heretical sect that says Jesus was less than God, and he said maybe this was the spirit that appeared to Moses, and then he dies, and so now Muhammad's left with this spirit. Anyway, in 610 A.D., Muhammad goes into Mecca and feels like there's something in his faith for everyone and nobody is excited about it. He gets confrontational. They chase him out of town first in 619 AD. His wife dies that year. It's his year of sorrows. And so then he tries going to a city of Al Taif. They don't want him. They pelt him with rocks and stones. And so in 622 AD, he goes to a majority Jewish city called Medina. And so they're nice and tolerant, and they let Muhammad in as the first ever Muslim immigrant. And he presents his faith, and they say, "You're not a prophet in the line of our Jewish prophets," but they let him stay. So he goes into the minority neighborhoods and he organizes a following, sort of like a community organizer. When the following gets big enough, he goes back to the Jews and he gets involved in politics. He pressures the Jews to accommodate him and his new followers politically. They make a treaty. So now Muhammad is a political leader in addition to being a religious leader. Then his followers back in Mecca get confrontational. They get chased out of town for disturbing the peace. Now there's lots of Muslim immigrants. The Jews let them in, and Muhammad allows them to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing them out. So the victimhood thing. We're the victims. They were intolerant of us, so we're justified in attacking their caravans. So this is different than Jesus, who said, if they take your coat, give them your shirt. And so Muhammad gets verses from his Allah that he gets a fifth of the booty from robbing caravans. One of the verses says, Allah has given you the slave girls as your booty. So he tells his men, you can have 4 wives plus as many extra women as your right hand possesses, as you take in battle. They're bondwomen, concubines, slave wives. They just don't have the status of a wife. And so the 624 AD, the Meccans send 1,000 soldiers to protect their caravan. And Muhammad, with 300, defeats 1,000 at the Battle of Badra. Mm. This amazing victory convinces him to be a military leader. And then in 627 AD, the Meccans send 10,000 soldiers to Medina, and Muhammad digs potholes and trenches all around the city. It's called the Battle of the Trench. And that renders the cavalry of the Meccans useless. You can't charge your horses across a field full of potholes and trenches. They'll break their legs. So Muhammad goes to some of the Meccans at night, bribes them, they slip away. Some of the other Meccans at night threatens them, they slip away. Sort of the Chicago politics, the bribe or the bullet. Gets freezing cold for a week. The rest of the Meccans lose heart and retreat. And Muhammad takes this as a victory that his enemies were cowards. He goes back into that Jewish city, gets offended at one of the Jewish tribes, confiscates their property, chases them out of town, and the other 2 tribes sort of stand down. Well, at least he's not picking on us, and they were always competition for me. Now there's only 2 Jewish tribes. He gets offended at the smaller of the 2. And the big tribe sort of stands back. Well, he's not picking on us, and they were always competition. Now there's only 1 Jewish tribe. And according to the Hadith, Muhammad is taking a bath, and that spirit appears to him and says, how can you rest when all his enemies are in your midst? He says, where points at that last Jewish neighborhood. He surrounds them for 28 days. When they surrender, he brings them into the market, chops off the head of the men, about 600 or 700, and then sells the women and children into slavery. So within 5 years of Muhammad coming into the Jewish city of Medina as an immigrant, there's not a Jew left in the city of Medina. They were chased out, killed, or enslaved. So when Mandami a couple weeks ago said, my religion began with the prophet being like an immigrant. And so it's a 3-step process. Immigrate, increase, eliminate. Immigrate as a religious refugee, and then increase the number of your followers in the minority neighborhoods and get involved in politics. And then you have random outbreaks of violence, usually by the young men. knifing, rapes, acid attacks, and the inhabitants of the neighborhood no longer feel safe and move out, and you take over the neighborhood.
Hmm.
And then you do the city by city, country by country, right? And there's a 1,400-year track record of watching this happen. So there's two ways it spreads. One is through the sword, and the other is through immigration, right? And it's called Dawah, Dawah, Dawah. It's immigration jihad, civilizational. So it's you come in to a host country, sort of like an invasive species, and then you grow and build. And it's interesting. Henry Ford did not like unions, and he's traveling the world looking for another source of rubber because originally it came from plants. And he's over in the Middle East, and a Yemeni man puts his luggage on the boat, does such a good job. Henry Ford said, if you show up in Detroit, I'll give you $5 a day. That begins this Arab migration into Detroit. And sure enough, they did not join unions, and they worked hard. And they enjoyed being in America. And they started the first Islamic association in America. They founded the first mosque in America, and they were friendly. And everybody says they're friendly, they're hard workers. There's nothing to fear. Let more in. More come in. They're friendly, they're hard workers. Let more in. And then they begin to build a community. And then an imam shows up, and he says, "Okay, now that we're all here, we need to start following the Quran a little bit closer. I saw your wife out shopping, and she was not covered modestly." He goes home and says, "You better start covering up." And then he sees somebody, "I saw you were having lunch with this infidel, and you're not supposed to be close friends with infidels." And it's like, and then your daughter was at a public swimming pool in a swimming suit in front, and these imams would gradually shepherd the community to becoming closer to following Muhammad's example. And so that brings up another interesting thing. Sharia, the word means law, and it's based on Muhammad. What Muhammad permitted is permitted. It is called halal. What Muhammad did not permit is not permitted. It is called haram. And so Muhammad liked cats. Cats are halal. They are permitted. Muhammad did not like dogs. Dogs are haram. They are not permitted. And so Sharia law is a long list of halals and harams, what's permitted and what's not permitted, and the local imam keeps the list. But if you ask, well, I want to know, why is that haram? I'm sorry, you can't ask why. But I really want to know, why is that haram? Don't ask again or I'll kill you. You don't even know why. It is just a religion of do's and don'ts. And the imam tells you what the do's and the don'ts are. And so Christians want to imitate Jesus, and Muslims want to imitate Muhammad, except in the Christian theology, you don't go to heaven by being like Jesus. You believe Jesus was the Lamb of God that took the punishment for our sins, so we don't take the punishment for our sins, right? He was the substitute. And it's the theological symbolism was in the Old Testament. You have the law and the Lamb, right? You have the Pentateuch, and there's all these laws, but all these sacrifices. And it's almost like for every law that's broken, there's a prescribed sacrifice. And then there's the once a year with the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when the sacrifice is sprinkled on the mercy seat and everyone's sins in the country are forgiven. They all start their new year off with a clean slate. And it's this idea that we're approaching God not because we're good enough. We're not good enough. Everybody breaks the law. We approach God because we're trusting in his mercy, right? And that this substitute. And I tell people that Jews have faith in the Lamb to come, Christians have faith in the Lamb that came, but the salvation is through the Lamb. You're trusting not in your being good enough, you're trusting in God's mercy, right? But there's none of that theology in Islam. It's just a religion of do's and don'ts, a religion of works. And the closer you can follow Muhammad's example, the better chance you have of going to paradise. But even Muhammad himself said, though I'm the prophet of Allah, I don't know what Allah will do with me. So he didn't even know. And so people say, I've read the Quran, I know Islam. Well, you don't. The Quran are private revelations to Muhammad, and there's the verses he gets in Mecca that are more peaceful, be respectful of the Jews and the Christians, the people of the book. But the verses he gets in Medina are more political and militant. And the later verses supersede or erase the earlier verses. Wow. But then there's the Hadith. There's 60,000 stories remembered about Muhammad from his wives and warriors. Then there's the Sirat, the biography of Muhammad, that puts his life in chronological order, written 100 years after his death. And then there's 1,400 years of rulings broken into 4 different schools of thought interpreting the Quran and the Hadith. It's
Mm.
very complicated.
Mm.
You have the Shiite and the Sunni versions,
And they fight too.
yeah, and that's an interesting story. I know I'm going in lots of different directions. The Sunni and Shiite is important to understand this for what's going on in Iran.
Mm.
Muhammad had a daughter, Fatima, married to Ali, and his followers are Shiite Ali or Shia or Shiite.
Mm.
15% of Muslims are Shiite. They're mostly in Iran.
Iranians.
Muhammad had lots of wives, and so he had lots of father-in-laws. But the father-in-law of Aisha, the 6-year-old that he married, consummated at 9, Aisha, her dad was Abu Bakr. And he fought with Muhammad in his battles, his 66 battles and raids. And he said, I know the way. So the word for the way is Sunni.
Mm.
So we have the Shia and the Sunni. Now, in the Battle of Karbala, if I'm not mistaken, is when Hussein, the son of Ali, was killed by the Sunnis.
Mm.
And so that started a blood feud that went on till now.
Till now. Yeah.
And the 12th descendant, the bloodline of Muhammad, they're called Sharifs, but the 12th one, he was 5 years old and disappears from history in the year 874. And the Shiite believe he's been hiding in a cave for 1,200 years. And that if the Ayatollah can create a world war on purpose, this 12th Imam, this Mahdi, will come out of the cave, and then their version of Christ, which is sort of the Christian version of the Antichrist, he will return, and together they'll kill the little Satan Israel, they'll kill the big Satan America, they'll kill all the Christians and all the Jews and all the apes and all the pigs, and they'll set up a one world government that's Islamic called the Caliphate. And so where the communists have nuclear weapons, but they're not in a hurry to use them, the Ayatollah, with this 12er version of Shia Islam, actually wants to create a global war to usher in this global government of Islam. And so that's why, both Trump and Hegseth said, we can't let this guy have the nuclear weapons because he will use them. He just got done killing 50,000 of his own people that were demonstrating.
I have to ask you, given how big all of this is, and I know that you're a God person, as am I. Do you believe in divine intervention? Do you think that when these things are just so big, the Lord is going to protect us? Do you believe that God has intervened in making America what it is? It just seems like such a miracle as we describe the founding of our country and the chances of a covenant and the roots of this country and the miracles that our country has experienced. Do you think there is the possibility of divine intervention?
I definitely do. If there was not divine intervention, God would not be just. How could he judge people if he's already determined what's going to happen? So my view is that we're going to get to the end. In Christian theology, it's the book of Revelation. We're going to get there, but it's like a GPS on your phone. If we repent, it can take the long way around. And if we don't repent, it's going to happen right away, right? And then I wrote a book called Believe, where I sort of get a little bit academic, but I talk about how God created light. And light is a photon, which is a perpendicular wave in the electromagnetic field. It travels at 186,000 miles per second. And visible light is one small part of the entire electromagnetic spectrum with gamma rays and ultraviolet rays. And so when God stretched out the heavens, he also stretched out the electromagnetic field so light could travel across the heavens anyway. But Einstein's theory of relativity is the closer you can travel approaching the speed of light, for you time would slow down. And if you could travel the speed of light, time would stand still. Well, God created light, so he's faster than light. So for God, time stands still. We'll never comprehend that. But the closest we can get is the verse, a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years. In other words, we're living in slow motion compared to God. God exists in the ever-present now. I am that I am. And when you're in his presence in prayer, you can't think about the past or the future. You're just in the presence of the Lord. And so for God to create our reality, he had to take now and stretch it out and slow it down. If you think of it, we have computers now called quantum computers that can do 1 billion times 1 billion computations a second, right? You can Google something. Is God that fast? Yeah, God can do infinity times infinity computations a second. He's so fast, he's faster than fast. He's outside of time. And you can Google a question on your phone. It'll go out to the entire internet, gather all the information, and sort it out and put it on your phone in a nanosecond. If man can make something that fast, is God that fast? Yeah, God's faster than fast. He's outside of time. And so we make our little free will decisions, but we're moving so slow, he can readjust every variable and every electron in the entire universe before he lets time move forward to the next nanoframe. Right, so time is moving, but the idea is why? It's because of free will. It's because he wants to allow us the freedom to make decisions, and and then I take it another step is that it goes back to God as love. He loves us and wants us to love him back, but for love to be loved, it must be voluntary.
Yeah, he can't force us.
And if he would force us, he himself would know he's forcing us, and he would know our response is not a love response because he knew he forced us. But he wants our love, but he'll never force us. I mean, what do you give somebody who has everything? I mean, God existed for eternity. I was reading about the Hubble telescope, and in 2003, they focused it on the spot in the sky where there's nothing. It's a tiny spot, size of a grain of sand, held between your fingers at arm's length against the night sky. Tiny spot, nothing there. After 11 days, they developed the images. In that tiny spot was 10,000 galaxies with hundreds of billions of stars in each galaxy. It's called the Hubble Ultra Deep Space Field. It's the furthest picture ever taken away from planet Earth up until this point. And every dot you see is a galaxy with hundreds of billions of stars, all in that little bitty space. Then they began to look in other directions. They now estimate the observable universe is 93 billion light years across and still expanding at the speed of light. And the largest star they found is Stephenson 2-18. It's a super gas giant. It's so large, if you were to place it in our solar system, it would engulf the orbit of Saturn, the 6th planet from the sun. We're the 3rd planet from the sun. Could you imagine one single star that enormous? And God made it all. And he made you. Why would he make you? Why would he make me? Why would he make us humans? What could we possibly offer a being that is that infinitely powerful? Nothing.
True love.
Except maybe something. What's a galaxy anyway? It's a bunch of rocks. Hot rocks, cold rocks, molten rocks, vaporized. A rock cannot love you. So it's almost like at some time in eternity past, God said to himself, been there, done that. I can create everything. I would really like someone in my image who could love me. Now it gets interesting because love, by definition, must be voluntary. So in the context of everything God controls, time, matter, space, energy, he intentionally created one tiny thing he does not control, your will. I mean, he's powerful enough to control it if he wanted to, but that would defeat the very reason he made us different than everything else. And he doesn't need our love. He's not incomplete in our love. He doesn't need our love, but he wants it. It's like parents don't need the love of their children, but they want it. Yeah. And the more you love somebody, the more you want that somebody to love you back. God loves you infinitely. He has an infinite desire for you to love him back, but he'll never force you. Because if he forces you, he'll know he's forcing you. But he wants your love, but he'll never force you. But he wants your love. I was adding another thing to it. So we're made in God's image. And what's the most important thing in our lives? Well, it's loving and being loved. I mean, it's having a purpose and all they're at. But when somebody's on their deathbed, they don't say, oh, yeah, tell my secretary this one last thing before I die. No, it's tell my wife and kids I love them. It's love. And so if we're made in so God loves everything he created. But the question is, could what he created love him back? Galaxies can't love. Rocks can't love. Electrons can't love. Animals follow instinct, right? And if you look up the word angel in the Bible, it appears in the King James 289 times, not one time is the word love used to describe an angel's relationship with God. They worship God, they praise God, they glorify God. Um, the word angel means messenger. They deliver God's messages, they deliver God's judgments, like in Egypt, right? They sang when the stars were created, they rejoice when a sinner converts. Jesus says, I'll confess you before the angels, they're heavenly witnesses. They're mighty beings, they're incomprehensibly powerful beings, but they're not made in God's image. And in Christian theology, Jesus did not die on the cross for angels. They were made for a purpose. It's like, what purpose were we made for? We're not powerful and we're not very smart. Well, a king can have a castle with really powerful soldiers, and then he can have children. A business owner that's a billionaire can have 100,000 employees that are really, really intelligent, and then he can have children, right?
Yeah.
It's like they were made for a purpose. And what purpose were we made for? Well, guess what? The word love is used all throughout the Bible to describe men and women's relationship with God.
Yeah.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Psalms 91, because he set his love upon me, therefore I will deliver him.